the picture of the redwood trees that you see there is right up above Highway 1 in Aptos. It's between State Park Drive and Rio Del Mar it's called Moosewood Drive. And so these trees would all come out if the highway expansion happens. Okay. So the project is about building auxiliary lanes. And, there's auxiliary lanes being built right now. So if you've been on Highway 1, you've seen the auxiliary lane project going on between Soquel Drive and 41st Avenue. And then just last weekend, they tore down the overpass at Capitola Avenue, right? And so that's the next section that's going to be done, which is from, Bay Porter to State Park Drive. So those are a couple miles of about 2.5 miles of auxiliary lanes that are going to be put in. Those are already funded. Those are happening. So what is an auxiliary lane? It's a lane that begins at an on-ramp and ends at the next off-ramp, otherwise known as an exit-only lane. So you see from this chart, there's already funded from Soquel to State Park Drive. The ones in question that we're talking about tonight in Aptos from State Park to Freedom are not fully funded, just partially funded. And there's a lawsuit about them that I'll talk about in a minute. So adding auxiliary lanes widens the bottle in between the bottlenecks. So according to the EIR, it says that the mainline capacity, that's the traffic flow throughput of the freeway at the interchanges, is unchanged by the project. And that stands to reason. You're not widening the bottlenecks, you're just widening the bottle. So the flow at the bottleneck remains the same. It could actually cause delay by putting an auxiliary lane. If people are using that auxiliary lane to kind of scoot out into where traffic's flowing a little faster, and then they want to merge back in, we know that that can cause delay. So let's talk about congestion relief and what the EIR says about that. There was a draft EIR for the project called the TSM alternative that analyzed all of the auxiliary lanes from Santa Cruz to Freedom Boulevard. Okay, so
what does TSM stand for again?
Say that again.
What does TSM stand for?
TSM, Transportation System Management. And that was defined as building auxiliary lanes and having ramp meters between Santa Cruz and Freedom. The conclusion was that this TSM alternative would result in a very slight improvement in traffic congestion when compared to the no-build alternative, and would not achieve sufficient congestion relief to attract any substantial number of vehicles that had been diverted to local streets back to the freeway. So that same EIR analyzed the first piece of this larger project, and that was the Soquel to 41st, the one that's being constructed right now. The conclusion was that in the southbound peak commute hour, would actually worsen traffic operations after it's built. And we understand what happens, in this Morrissey to Soquel auxiliary lane, which was completed in 2013, we see that it's just as congested as the through lanes. So you recall this, the EIR, the draft EIR was in 2015. In the very next year, the Regional Transportation Commission, which decides how to spend our transportation dollars, it created what they called Measure D. And right before the measure got its letter as Measure D, they sent out this mailer to all voters in the county, and it said the auxiliary lanes will ease congestion on Highway 1. So there was a promise that was inconsistent with the data. The data said very slight congestion relief, but the mailer said, hey, let's move, let's spend this money because it'll ease congestion. So let's look at the recent EIR, which is just on the Aptos segment, just from the State Park to Freedom Boulevard. It concludes that in the opening year of the project, there'll actually be a slower northbound commute in the morning peak period. It does conclude that the southbound commute will be improved, but that's just in the opening year, and does not account for induced travel, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So induced travel is what Susan Handy from UC Davis describes. Adding capacity to roadways fails to alleviate congestion for long because it actually increases vehicle miles traveled. It's attracting people who would not otherwise travel. It's people are moving, are relocating their jobs and their housing based on the transitory congestion relief that happens. So these folks have just studied road congestion, and their conclusion is that within about 10 years, we see the full effect of induced travel. This is a Caltrans graphic that explains induced travel. So you can go on a website and find this graphic that, bigger roads means that adding a lane helps at first, but then more cars jump on, they make it longer trips, they're shifting from other modes, they're making decisions. And, most of us would never dream of traveling on Highway 1 between, 3 and 6 p.m. if we don't have to. Well, once there's a little bit of congestion relief, people start to make different decisions and the road fills back up. So back to the EIR, which came out recently in February. They said that this southbound congestion relief, they didn't make an estimate. It's in the opening year there's relief, but they didn't estimate what happens in 5 years, what happens in 10 years. They did estimate it 20 years, and there's no improvement in delay at 20 years. So I put this quote in from Linda Wilshusen. She is the former executive director of the Santa Cruz Regional Transportation Commission, the RTC. She says, she wrote comments on the EIR. She said the data in the draft EIR itself demonstrates no sustained traffic relief benefit from this project. This project does not accomplish the stated purpose and need, which is, of course, congestion relief. I think this is significant. Linda Wilshusen was the executive director for 20 years between about 1985 and 2006. And, it was under her watch that this whole idea of expanding the freeway began. And so we have her coming full circle and saying, it's not going to do any good to do this Aptos auxiliary lane project. About safety, well, the final EIR claims that there's going to be increased safety, but that's in contradiction to this overall EIR, which said that accident rates would be the same. And so we looked into that more, and we found that actually they didn't analyze safety. This statement is not backed up by any actual analysis. They took an off-the-shelf sort of coefficient, a safety coefficient from a national highway survey, and they plugged it in as if when you add auxiliary lanes, you always get safety benefit. Well, not true. Caltrans has a highway design manual that recommends that when auxiliary lanes when the interchanges are less than 2,000 feet apart, then it's good to do an auxiliary lane because it allows cars to merge safely. But this project is way longer than 2,000 feet. It's more like 6,000. And so this is much longer than needed for safety. So again, I mentioned they did not actually analyze crash probabilities. So let's look at the cost versus the benefit of these auxiliary lanes. What I've already said is the potential benefit of congestion relief in the morning. Well, actually, the outcome would be worse in the opening year. Afternoon congestion, short-term relief in the opening year, there would be, but it wasn't analyzed beyond the opening year, and safety was not analyzed. I mentioned these 1,100 trees that would be removed. And one of the big costs is just the opportunity cost. This is a very expensive project because There's Aptos Creek, there's Valencia Creek, there's 2 railroad bridges that need to be tore down and rebuilt. This is super expensive. It's not just like widening in between on-ramps and off-ramps. And that money could be better spent elsewhere. And for example, we have streets that are not safe. We have in our county a rate of serious injuries to pedestrians that's the worst, that's 5th worst out of 58 counties, and to bicyclists, the 2nd worst out of 58 counties. There's a state office of traffic safety where you can find these figures for any city or county. The county has adopted Vision Zero, as well as some of the cities, Watsonville, Santa Cruz, Scotts Valley, but we're not on track to meet the goal. The rate of injuries remains terribly high. So a second thing we could spend money on is transit. And we had this man, Jarrett Walker, who is actually a world-renowned transit planner. He is from Portland. He came to, at the invitation of the Regional Transportation Commission, to weigh in on the big debate about the rail corridor. What to do, should we have just a trail only on the rail corridor, or should we have transit on the rail corridor? And predictably, he's a transit planner. He said, well, we should have both. We should have transit. But he did something that was not necessarily invited by the RTC. He weighed in on another issue. And that was, he looked at our transit situation and he said, you folks need more transit in this community. And simply a higher level of service, meaning more frequent transit, would be more helpful to us if we invested in that. Unfortunately, Jarrett Walker's advice was not heeded. In the very same year, just 6 months later after he came, the RTC has this study that was underway, and they removed from their preferred scenario in this study increased transit frequency on Soquel Drive and Freedom Boulevard. It had been in this study, but they dropped it from their preferred scenario. So we know that there's a need for transit prioritization if we're going to have efficient bus travel. And there actually was, 2 years ago, a grant application for Soquel Drive to make transit signal prioritization. And that means when the bus comes to the intersection, if the light's red, the bus can electronically get the light to turn green. Pretty cool. It also was, this grant application was for bus shelters, for boarding platforms, and off-boarding ticketing. That expedites people getting on the bus so the bus could make better time. Also, people need to get to the bus, right? They need sidewalks and protected bike lanes on Soquel Drive, which would be wonderful. The unfortunate thing is this grant application was denied because it was combined with a grant application for auxiliary lanes. Well, actually, we don't know exactly why, because the staff at the state level score these grants, and they don't make it us aware of what, how the grant did not pass muster. But we are concluding that if this grant application was all by itself, this would have been a shoo-in with all kinds of, with money for buses, for pedestrians, and for bicyclists. But since it was combined with a freeway application, that it's denied. That's our conclusion, but it's speculation. Let me just be clear that this project has been called auxiliary lanes and bus on shoulder. That's a misnomer. So everywhere else in the country, you see something like that, where they have real bus on shoulder. You'll see something like this. The bus has its own lane. In 2013, there was legislation allowing Santa Cruz and Monterey counties to dedicate the shoulder, to widen or to pave the shoulder of the highway in order to have a bus-only lane. That's not what the RTC is doing. What they're doing, you see by this map, the only portions where the bus has its own lane are those orange portions. Do you see at Bay Porter and at Park? As the buses cross the overpass, they will have their own lane. And then the rest of the time, they will be in the auxiliary lanes. That's the plan. So we call it a misnomer to call this a bus on shoulder project because really there are very short segments where it'll be a bus only lane. If we had real bus on shoulder, you can imagine the result because we have an express bus from Watsonville to Santa Cruz. In the peak hours, it's stuck in traffic. But in the off-peak hours, it only takes 36 minutes to get from Watsonville, Green Valley Road and Main Street to the Santa Cruz County building. That's pretty darn good time. And you can imagine if that bus were able to approximate that level of efficiency, it might attract people who are getting to jobs in Santa Cruz from Watsonville. Then we have, I'm just going to talk very briefly about this, but it's an enormous subject that could take a whole lot of time. But people in Watsonville, the average household income is spent, 20% is spent on transportation. And you can see where in San Francisco, it's only 9%. Why? Because San Francisco has such a great public transit system that people can get to where they want to go conveniently and inexpensively. So the people in Watsonville are chained to their cars for all practical purposes. They're not options. It's just not options. So let's talk for a minute about how we change priorities. We've got a legal strategy and a political strategy. The legal strategy, I'm going to stop the sharing for a second. The legal strategy is that the Sierra Club and the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation, I'm the chair of the Campaign for Sustainable Transportation. So we've joined together on a lawsuit that says a couple things. One is Caltrans, you didn't examine alternatives. You're required to examine alternatives in an environmental impact report. And this EIR only examined the project, auxiliary lanes, and the no build, right? But you're supposed to have a third alternative that you examined. They didn't do that. The second thing is that Caltrans did not follow the law in examining and analyzing vehicle miles traveled, including that induced travel, that cars show up when new pavement is created. So they are claiming an exemption. They're claiming these auxiliary lanes are less than a mile in length. Caltrans claims that the auxiliary lane is 0.99 miles. Okay, so it's less than 1 mile in length. Therefore, they are exempt. That's a misreading of the state requirements. I won't go into the details, but Caltrans is there. It's trying to do an end run around the requirement to not only analyze vehicle miles traveled, but to mitigate substantial increases in vehicle miles traveled as a result of projects. So the state has recently enacted regulations as of 2020 that says when you're widening roads, you got to analyze the increased traffic that you're creating, and you got to mitigate those because those are sources of greenhouse gases. So you've got to put money into the bus system, for example, or make the streets safer so people will ride their bike and so on. So Caltrans is not, there's no money designed for mitigation. So that's another grounds on which we're suing. I can explain more later if people are interested in the legal aspect of things. But I want to go back to the slideshow for a second. So what we can do. So there is an RTC meeting May 1st. And that's at the Capitola City Hall. And I'm going to be, if you're on you're going to be on my email list. If you want to get off, just unsubscribe at the bottom. I'll send emails, but you can always unsubscribe. But I'll send you a notice about this meeting as we confirm the fact that we're going to have a discussion of the auxiliary lanes at this meeting. We don't know quite yet until the agenda comes out. So we're going to coordinate our comments. So I'll be communicating with you if you're able to, is particularly if you live in Aptos, it's really more powerful for you to get up and speak at that meeting. You can also Zoom into the meeting and make a comment that way. Money for the lawsuit, we need $21,000 more. We already have a bunch of money collected. I'll tell you why later, but we need 21,000 more. Our attorney is doing this on a partial contingency basis, meaning it's going to cost him a whole lot more to do this lawsuit than we're paying him. If he loses the lawsuit, he ends up getting paid a whole lot less for his time than he would otherwise. But he's doing it because his name is Bill Parkin. He lives in Aptos. He works in Aptos. He cares about how, he doesn't want to see Aptos desecrated, basically. The other thing I want to invite you to is this event. This is happening on May 3rd at the Resource Center for Nonviolence. We're saluting the folks who have gone before and really laid the groundwork for what we're doing now. Peter and Celia Scott, many of you know them, who are the two people maybe most prominently responsible for the reason that we have a POGANIP that's open space today, and Arana Gulch, that we don't have a city of 30,000 people at Wilder Ranch. Instead, we have a state park. That we don't have a nuclear power plant at Davenport. All these things that the Scots and others were involved in, and in particular, we're saluting them for their work against a highway, a freeway that would have run from Highway 17 through Santa Cruz to the North Coast, with a freeway going to the boardwalk and back up Bay Street, looping back to the main freeway. And some of these other folks, Debbie Bulger, Bill Malone, Paul Elric, Bruce Van Allen, were involved in fighting the highway tax of 2004. So I'm going to stop my screen. And at this point, I'm going to stop the recording and we can have a discussion.